Greetings, everyone. Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm speaking to you from New Mexico, traditional homelands of the Pueblo, Diné, Apache, and the Ute peoples. My name is Subhankar Banerjee. I teach in the Art and Ecology area at the University of New Mexico and serve as the founding director of both the Species in Peril project at UNM and the UNM Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities. Earth Day is coming up in little over 2 weeks. I'll begin by showing you a short 2-minute video from the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970.
Most participants in Earth Day were white. Although some Negroes did take part, Negro leadership was conspicuously absent. Black militants and campus radicals have criticized the environmental campaign, calling it a white middle-class diversion from the issues of Vietnam and race. But members of at least one minority group, Mexican Americans, took part in Earth Day in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Bob Schieffer reports.
They gathered here in an atmosphere of fiesta, many of them dressed in native folk costumes and listening to a strolling mariachi band. But beneath all the gaiety, there was an undercurrent of cynicism. This is Bareilles, where the poor people of Albuquerque live. And to the young Chicanos who organized this rally, the environmental crisis is a very real and a very personal issue.
We're going to make people understand that the kind of things that come from air pollution, water pollution, are the same kinds of things that cause racism, that cause poverty, that cause hunger in this country. So we're all going to be marching today, okay? Unidos marchemos y unidos venceremos. ¡Viva la raza! ¡Viva!
The march moved out and snaked through the city's worst poverty area. There were young people mostly, many from the University of New Mexico on the other side of town. The Chicano Student Organization had endorsed the environment activities on campus, but they contended the real crisis was here. They carried signs saying free the brown people and Chicano power, and they followed a route seldom seen by outsiders. It is a neighborhood of dirt roads, outdoor plumbing, and adobe houses. The city's waste disposal plant is a few blocks away, and on windy days it covers the area with a choking gas. Eventually, the city hopes to correct it. The turnout was a small one, no more than 300 by police count. The young organizers had hoped for 3,000. Still, they were philosophical about it. Down here, one of them said, life just goes on from day to day. Nobody ever gets too excited about anything anymore. Bob Schieffer, CBS News.
Those words spoken by organizers Arturo Sandoval could be considered among the first articulation of environmental justice. If you just Google Earth Day 1970 Albuquerque CBS News Part 8, you will see this video on YouTube. The video was posted on YouTube in 2010. It has been watched about 3,500 times over the past 11 years. Whereas, compare this, the social media posts on Senator Bernie Sanders' made in Vermont wool mittens that he wore during the Biden-Harris inauguration have been seen and shared by millions around the world. The contribution to environmental justice by Chicana organizers in Albuquerque on the inaugural Earth Day has been all but erased from public memory and continue to largely remain unknown to the general public and even among most environmental scholars across this nation. Over the following 2 decades, the work of the Chicana organizers in Albuquerque and their indigenous Black and brown colleagues from around the country eventually led to the convening in 1991 in Washington, D.C., the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, in which the principles of environmental justice was drafted and adopted. But it took another 30 years for environmental justice to be regarded not as a side or footnote, but at the very center of federal US environmental public policy today, in which UNM alum, Madam Secretary Deb Haaland, has a significant leadership role to play. I take a moment to celebrate with you Madam Secretary Deb Haaland the first Native American cabinet secretary, and the first woman to head the US Department of the Interior, the very federal agency that once aimed to civilize or exterminate the indigenous peoples of this nation. In April 1970, Chicano student organizers in Albuquerque, New Mexico, demanded environmental justice. 51 years later, in this April 2021, we are very pleased to host Chicano storyteller and cartoonist Zeke Peña, who was born in southern New Mexico and raised in West Texas, and whose work highlights how art, visual culture, and stories can engage with and contribute to the ongoing struggles for environmental justice, and additionally, in case of Zeke Peña, also struggles for multi-species justice. Zeke Peña is the inaugural Art and Ecology Artist-in-Residence of the recently established UNM Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities. I urge you to explore the center's webpage, where interestingly, you will find center at the very center of the list of menus on the Department of Arts website, art.unm.edu. In fall 2019, 516 Arts in Albuquerque presented the exhibition Species in Peril Along the Rio Grande, which I co-curated with Dr. Josie Lopez, curator of art at the Albuquerque Museum. The exhibition included 2 illustrations by Zeke Peña, The River and All Against the Wall. Both are exemplary works of environmental and multi-species justice. I thank my friend Kerry Doyle, director of the Rubin Center for the Visual Arts at the University of Texas at El Paso, for introducing me to Zeke, and to my friend Kevin Bixby, executive director of the Southwest Environmental Center in Las Cruces, whose support helped create All Against the Wall. This evening's event is co-presented with UNM Art Museum. I now welcome my dear friend Arif Khan, director of the UNM Art Museum, to share a few words. Arif, take it away.
Thank you, Subhankar. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And a little quick logistics for our talk today is there'll be some brief introductions. Then our guest speaker, Zeke Peña, will do his presentation, and then I'll be moderating a panel between Subhankar and our grad student, Ellie, who I'll introduce here in a second. And questions. We welcome questions for the audience throughout the presentation. Please submit them through the Q&A tab located at the bottom of your screen. Again, it's an honor to be on this panel and to partner with the Art and Ecology program at UNM. Since my time as director, a little over 5 years, we have a good history of working together, starting with presenting Subhankar's photography in an exhibition, Long Environmentalism in the Near North, which then led to one of my favorite things we've done since I've been director of the museum, co-presenting the Last Oil Conference at UNM. Most recently, we worked with the newly formed Center for Environmental Arts and Humanities in presenting the virtual exhibition, There Must Be Other Names for the River. If you go to the UNM Art Museum's website, you'll be able to find that and check it out. That project was done by 3 UNM Art and Ecology students and was inspired by the Art and Ecology program. So please check that out. So the timing of this talk is really great for what we are doing at the museum. One of the best parts and one of my favorite things about being at a university museum is the chance to work with and value the input of students at UNM. I would like to thank Eleonora Edreva, a first-year MFA student in the Art and Ecology program, for working with us all on the marketing materials and coordinating our meetings to plan this talk. And I'm going to introduce Ellie now to introduce our speaker, Zeke Peña. Ellie, I'll hand it over to you.
Cool, thank you so much, Arif, and thank you, Subhankar, also. My name is Eleonora Edreva, and I am a first-year MFA student in Art and Ecology, and I'm really honored to introduce our speaker, Zeke Peña, tonight. I've been working with Zeke this semester to plan the events for his residency, and getting to know him and his work throughout this process has really been one of the highlights of the semester for me. Today actually marks the first day of his events for the residency, which include not only the talk this evening, but also 2 class visits that he did earlier today in the 2 sections of the Introduction to Art and Ecology course, one of which I teach. And we'll share more about that later on in the evening, and about other upcoming events that are coming up for Zeke's residency. So now a little bit about Zeke without giving any spoilers to the presentation he's about to share with us. Zeke Peña is a storyteller and cartoonist born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and raised in El Paso, Texas. Zeke makes comics and visual narratives to reclaim stories and remix history. His transmedia work uses a mashup of political cartoon, border rascuache, and hip-hop culture to address universal themes of identity, politics, ecology, and social justice. Zeke is one of the most exciting illustrators of his generation, creating work that is deeply community engaged and place-based. The manner in which Zeke addresses ecological and social issues through visual narrative is thought-provoking and engaging, and for me, most notably, really intergenerationally appealing, which I view as a really important component of telling these types of community-based histories. Zeke received a degree in art history from the University of Texas at Austin. His illustrations and paintings have been exhibited in several museums and galleries, including the Rubin Center for the Visual Arts at the University of Texas, El Paso, as well as 516 Arts here in Albuquerque. Zeke has won awards for his book illustrations, and his work is in several collections of American and Chicano art. During the Art and Ecology residency, Zeke is creating comic illustrations for his ongoing project River Stories, which he'll share more about with us this evening. Welcome, Zeke, and thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Thank you so much, Arif. Thank you, Subhankar. Greetings, friends. I am Zeke Peña. To all the elders in this space, thank you for letting me speak before you. I am Chicano, and I also want to acknowledge my ancestors and the ones who came before me to make it so that I could be here with you today. Especially, my mother, whose family has lived in the Mesilla Valley in a small farming community north of Las Cruces for many generations. My father's family is from the states of Coahuila and Durango in Mexico by way of the Rio Grande Valley in San Antonio, Texas. I was born in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I grew up in El Paso, Texas. Today, I'm grateful to be speaking with you from Cherokee and Caddo territory here in Northwest Arkansas, where I recently moved. And I'm a cartoonist and storyteller, as Ellie mentioned. I'm really grateful to the UNM Center of Environmental Art and Humanities, to the UNM Art Museum, for the opportunity to be with you all here today. And I want to, just quickly acknowledge the tough times that we're in, and a lot of the tough things that we're dealing with, especially in our communities of color and society as a whole. So I appreciate your time and energy being here with me today. I hope to speak from the heart, and I pray that we all can continue to live our lives in a good way. And so I'm just going to quickly go through some of my work. So let me share my screen. Give me 1 second. I could get a thumbs up from one of our presenters to make sure that's presenting correctly. Thank you. Okay. So the work that I'm going to be speaking about today is centered around the river. I'm going to go briefly through the first part of this presentation so that we can get to the exciting part, some of the projects that I'm working on for this residency. My work remixes things or moments that don't belong together. George Washington crossing the Rio Grande to call out American industries that live on the backs of migrant labor. This is from a series called The Disaster of Walls. A mashup of culture and symbols to put a timeline of the river's history in one image. An exaggerated reality into the absurd, or satirical to uncover a more apparent truth. Sometimes using symbols to tell a story about our present moment and things going on in our world. I use visual metaphors like writing rap lyrics to speak a visual language the people in my community can understand. My work is almost always narrative and centered around a story about my community. In 2013, I received an artist incubator grant from the Museum and Cultural Affairs Department in El Paso to work on a project by the name of Waterbound. I started this collaborative project to raise awareness about immigration and access to water. The first event for this project took place along the river at a spot where it is claimed that the brutal conquistador Oñate crossed the river. Here you can see the paintings that were made for this project. There were 4 large-scale paintings, and you'll see later on that my work looks very different here from some of the first images that I shared, and I'll share some more about that later. This exhibit took place in 2014. It was a gathering of community. There was music. There were some participatory elements that the community can engage with. And it was really a interdisciplinary or a transmedia kind of exhibition. This is another instance of exhibiting this work in 2015 at Juarez Contemporary in Ciudad Juarez, in Chihuahua, Mexico. Here's some more shots from that installation with the community there looking at the work. In 2015, I received another grant from Museum and Cultural Affairs Department in El Paso for Bravo Grande, a project about trying to better understand how the community's relationship with the river has changed because of the border and encourage people to reflect on their own stories. During the exhibitions of the Waterbound project, the group that was helping me work on this, and I'll stress this later, but this is a group of people that are helping me with this project. And they're friends in the community, helping conceptualize the ideas, helping with the installations and the exhibits, helping make contact to people in the community to have conversation with and to feature in the work. So during the exhibition of Waterbound and working on that project, we gathered surveys and interviews that made something really clear. There was a generational shift in the community's relationship with the river. Older people in the community had some really significant memories with the river, like fishing, swimming, family gatherings, birthday parties on the riverbanks, just some really nice images and interaction with our river. Younger people didn't have the same connection and really only associated the river with being the border between the United States and Mexico. Bravo Grande was about trying to better understand how that relationship with the river changed. So through conversations with people in the community, this is featuring an excerpt from an interview with a member of our community there in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso, Casandro el Exótico, who is a friend, and you can see, ese río siempre era la dualidad de las dos ciudades, el río siempre nos conectaba. The river was always the duality of the two cities. The river has always connected us. So based on these interviews and conversations, I worked on several paintings. This is one of the paintings that you can see here. And these are oil paintings on reclaimed wood. And you know, the backdrop that you're seeing behind there is a backdrop of myths, right? So how the contrast between the people in our community and the way that media, popular media, and the news about the border is romanticized, radicalized, mythified, and misrepresented. And the people in the community speak some truth, you know, to the complex ideas about the transfronteriza experience, right? This kind of cross-border experience. And so what you're seeing here in the background of Casandro is a virtually augmented element of the paintings. When you hold the device to the paintings, you tap on the screen and this animation is activated behind the painting. And there is audio, an audio interview with the person that's portrayed in the painting, discussing their relationship with the river. This augmentation, I want to acknowledge the work that David Figueroa from Augment El Paso has done. We have a long time collaboration. I'll be talking about David and Augment El Paso later. I encourage you to visit augmentelpaso.com to check out more of the work that they're doing. Also speaking with other people in our community, Rick Quesada from the Isleta, from the Isleta del Sur Tigo Pueblo. And the border has been detrimental to our religious calendar and spiritual connection to the river. So talking also about these generational things, right? And I will say that the people in Isleta del Sur have experienced some of the most significant changes in the river and the impact that the border has had and how detrimental it's been to their culture and their way of life. Talking, with several people. These are some photographs from one of the exhibits. This was at the Chamisol National Memorial in one of the exhibition spaces they have there, one of the gallery spaces. So these are just some photos of people that we spoke with. There was a video present. Don't quite have time to share it with you today, but video interviews, scenes from the river, and then another look at some of the paintings. In 2016, I exhibited, Reclaim at the Rubin Center for Visual Art on the University of Texas at El Paso campus. It was an important project for me because it was the last time I painted on a large scale and started down a new path of cartooning, illustrating, and making comics. And so you see some of the elements here, the video, and this exhibit focused a little bit more on some of the political histories around the river. So looking at some of the treaties and some of the laws that have been passed that have had an impact on the condition of the river. And then on the top right of your screen was a large painting in one of the main areas of the museum. And then below that was a drawing on the wall. So this drawing on the wall features, again, some of the political history. And people who went to view this space were encouraged to take erasers and decide whether or not they were going to erase some of the history or engage some of the history, and really just giving that access and that interplay with the community to allow that to happen in the space. And so, I'm always looking for places to provide space for engagement and participation, to create those, kind of feedback loops with the work, so that the people who are engaging with the work can participate, and it informs the work moving forward. During this time, there was also a lot of youth outreach. So this is, I'm working here with a group of students from Bowie High School. A friend, Louis Lowry, who is a science teacher at Bowie High School. For those who are not familiar, Bowie High School is located just about 50 yards from the river and from the border. And these students on a daily basis are, living in the space of the river. And so it was a really great opportunity to have conversation with them and, discuss what their ideas were, what their experiences have been about the river. And this was really what was highlighting that perception of the river really being something that people mostly perceived as being the international boundary marker. So here we're working on a mural that was a collaborative mural, taking some of their ideas. Here's some more of the student work. And then we participated in this exercise where I asked people to think about the river space and the space about the river, around the river, and asked them how they would change that space and design that space differently. And these are some of the ideas they came up with. One on the top right of the screen, someone wanted to create a skate park in the river. Now, I'm not sure how ecologically friendly that is, or I'm not sure how good that would be for the river. But it was just an exercise to really give them access to something that I think the border really keeps us from, right? Like that there's this distance that's created where we don't feel like we have access, and in the way that the river and the space around the river are really controlled and surveilled and militarized, right? So this work is all centered around this notion, right? That trying to create some distance between these two concepts, the river and the border, because so much of the community in the area has this perception, myself included growing up, right? Um, this work is looking at trying to acknowledge the river and honor the river really, and respect the river's history and learn more about it. And is really just looking at a simple question. And this is the question for me personally, which is at the heart of this work. And it's, why does the river look this way? Growing up, you know, it's not something that stood out to me, but later in my life, I wonder, why is the river in this condition? On the left of your screen, you're seeing the headwaters for the river in Colorado. And on the right of your screen, you're seeing the view from Puente Santa Fe, looking down at the river with Puente Negro in the distance there. And so there's this idea going throughout this, the idea of public space and access. And here you're looking at a still from a video that I found on YouTube actually, which shows families from Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. They're swimming in the river that was lined with concrete after the Chamisol Treaty and the Chamisol Canal was built. So in 1967, the Chamisol Canal was completed. Excuse me. And this is one of the most significant changes to this section of the river. This is where the river was halted. It was the canals were built, canalized, and really changed the river in an extremely significant way. And it was extremely detrimental to the riparian system, to the watershed, to all of the things that allow our river to be a healthy river. And so there are questions here, you know, is why isn't the river area a place that where we gather anymore? While there are still some people that swim in the river, it's not something that is done on a large scale, especially for those living on the side of El Paso. And then how does this change? How does this lack of interaction with the river and lack of relationship with the river, how does it change our culture and affect you know, our relationship with each other and the relationship with the community? And then most importantly, how do these changes affect our relationship with the river itself? So I come from a freelance practice, right? And I've always had to juggle working on many projects simultaneously. My work can appear to be sometimes a little chaotic. I hope this isn't going to be too messy for you all, or disorganized. But I also am not doing this work in a linear way. I'm always returning to work. I'm cycling through work and circling back to projects and narratives to continue building and editing them. This work is not static. You know, it's dynamic and it develops organically for me. I also try my best to follow the natural cycles of the sky and our natural world. And after having to take a break for some personal reasons, I'm trying to be more mindful about caring for myself, from, you know, taking a break from this work. And as I move forward, I'm trying to be more mindful of taking care of myself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share now some of the projects that I've been working on during this residency. And you know, I'll be forthright. You know, this process has been very unique. It has not been like any other residency experience I've had. I'm very much used to engaging with the community, like the amazing class visits that I had the opportunity to have today with Ellie's class and the other class I met with. And this conversation and being able to have conversation with people and speak about the work, it's something that's been missing a little bit as I sit, you know, in my studio alone for most of the time. But I'm hoping that moving forward, you know, we'll be able to kind of create some more dialogue. And I want to encourage you all, everyone in the audience. I would love to hear your feedback on this work. And if something comes to mind, I would love to hear what you have to say, any suggestions or anything that comes to mind. So I'm going to share some of these projects here. So let's start off. So La Semilla Food Center's mission is to build a healthy, self-reliant, fair, and sustainable food system in the Paso del Norte region of southern New Mexico and El Paso, Texas, through agroecological farming, training, and technical support for local growers, community and school-based education, policy, advocacy, and community development. Their work is multifaceted, community-based, and rooted in justice and radical hope in the face of past and present systemic harms. This Farm Bill zine began in 2019 with the support of the Food and Farms Communication Fund and is part of La Semilla's storytelling initiatives to share histories and stories that uplift regional foodways, culture, connect it to a broader history and food justice movements. I've included some information there with their Twitter, their Facebook, and their website. I encourage you to visit them and support the work that they're doing. So I'm very grateful to another collaborator who has also, I want to acknowledge, for helping on the waterbound projects and has just been someone that has been an excellent person to work with, Ruby Orozco Santos, who recently started working with La Semilla as of last year. And Ruby contacted me to work on this project about the Farm Bill. And this project for me, it came at really a perfect time. I had just finished the first phase of the River Stories project, which I will discuss in a little bit. And I was starting to really identify the need for myself to figure out my own relationship to the river and what my family's relationship to the river was. And this led me quickly to farming. I'll talk about this later, but on both sides of my family, I come from farming and a close connection and reliance on the river. And so this connection to farming made this project with La Semilla, this Farm Bill zine, really exciting, that I had the opportunity to learn more about farming in the community and in the region. And specifically with this project, how things like the policies that are included in our Farm Bill have an impact on our community and our food systems. So what you're looking at here is just one spread for this. This project is a work in progress, and we are continuing to edit. So I thought it was better just to share some of the individual spreads. So you're going to just be looking at some excerpts here. So this looks at the historical. It touches briefly on some of the history around farming in the region, and also addresses some of the history of settlement, colonization, the brutal colonization of this region, the displacement of indigenous people in this community. And, it looks at how this, how American expansionism, right, and the colonization of the region in Paso del Norte, what we know today as Paso del Norte, is also connected to the Farm Bill and the policies in the Farm Bill. And it also looks at some of the practices in the agricultural industry, or agribusiness. And so it's a brief survey. It is really important. It was really important to us in setting the intentions for this project that these concepts and themes be very accessible to the community, and also that it be accessible to a young audience. And this is something that I'm always interested in all of my work, is making sure that young people are able to engage with it, because I think that it's a great way of thinking that if young people can engage with the work, I feel like it makes it accessible for anyone. And so the narrative, Ruby Orozco Santos, is crafting the narrative with the help of other folks in the La Semilla group. It's a collaborative effort. We're all editing and having conversation about the story and how to frame these things. And as I mentioned before, it dives into the connection to historical moments in terms of, the food supply chain, access to the Farm Bill in its inception, right? And how it was very limited to people of color. And then also, just reading here, the lack of civil rights and representation in federal and local decision-making bodies resulted in unequal opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx farmers, right? So it's really just in a small space. It's going to be a little printed zine, something that can be easily distributed at events, at functions that La Semilla Food Center has. And in a brief way is trying to make these concepts and how the Farm Bill has an impact on our food system more familiar to the community. So moving forward, Andrea Andy Everett is from Isleta del Sur Pueblo and resides within the pueblo with her family and her dog, Shuide. She is an active participant in ceremonial and cultural dances of her community. Andrea holds a bachelor's in environmental science with a geoscience concentration and a master's in environmental science with a graduate certificate in geographic information science and technology. And so I'm really grateful for this partnership. I also want to acknowledge Andrea, Andy. I believe Andy's in the audience today. Thank you for being here. And Andrea is doing some amazing work, connected to the river, looking at the river and, addressing regional land concerns, as you can see there. I had intentions of sharing in the link in the chat, but if you are interested in this work, please contact me for the link to Andrea's work so you can look more into it. And so our conversations started actually when I was working on the River Stories project, maybe a little bit before that. And I'm grateful to Ana Linda Moreno from El Paso, Texas, who put me in contact with the folks who live in the pueblo there at Isleta del Sur, and to learn more about the river and to learn more about their relationship with the river and longstanding relationship with the river. And so the collaboration that we're working on is that Andrea is working, I'm going to read here, is working on an intersection of geospatial technologies with cultural competencies used to enhance and explain the feedback loops and patterns of human and natural systems of the Rio Grande River. The project used ecosystem services as a bridge between Western thought and traditional ecological knowledge, a thoughtful consideration of what it means to be interconnected to the cultural space and a manifestation of the Tigua's culture, cultural identity, economy, and community through time and space. I want to read just one more here, and this is a quote from Cacique Sierra. They go to the river and talk to the river, and the river sends it down. And so I'm with both the La Semilla project and the collaborative work that I'm doing with Andrea. I'm very much interested in supporting the community, and the way I see it is that I'm an illustrator and I'm good at drawing. I'm pretty good at storytelling, and I like to be accessible to the community and available to the community to support projects like this and work like this. And so it's been exciting for me to work with Andrea to have conversations about how I can do that. Oops, I skipped way too far ahead. So during this residency, I'm making some illustrations and visuals to support the important work that Andrea is doing, and I'm developing some visuals based on some of the research to provide another way for people to engage with her work. And so what you're looking at here is a still somewhat rough. So a lot of the work that you're going to see from here moving out is work in progress. But you see here in this quote, the Rio Grande is a reflection of social principles of different ethnicity groups and cultures living along it. The dependence of its waters, lands, and the biotic services are intertwined in the lives of the people and the economies that are created within this landscape. And so from the what I'm providing is I'm providing just a different way to represent some of the visual elements in Andrea's research and Andrea's work. And so, I think that for me, this is something that I really look forward to in my practice, right? Is how can I utilize these skills and these tools that I have to support other people's work? And these color sketches that you're looking at here, I'll be developing these. You can see some of these are rough pencil sketches on paper. And I think that, it's important to me to not only just be working on stuff that I initiate. I think that I should also be working to support other people's work. And this project is excellent, and this collaboration is excellent for that purpose. Here are some more images. All of these images are based on Andrea's research and photographs that Andrea has taken during the time of the research. And really just trying to provide a different way for people to engage with the important, information that Andrea is bringing to the table with the hope that it betters, our relationship with the river. Here's one more. You can see the border fence down there on the bottom left. And then another part of this, just briefly, Andrea also contacted me and asked me to make some images for a panel that they participated in for Water Week at the University of Texas, El Paso. This was an amazing honor for me to have the ability to, use my illustrations and use my work and my hands to make something for them. I'm not going to share any of the other illustrations that I made, out of respect for, the images and stories that are there with them. They're not mine to share. But what you are looking at is one of the portraits of their cacique, Cacique Manuel Ortega. So those two projects are some community projects that I'm working on. And this is kind of looping it back to the work that I was explaining before about the river, which is river stories, and continuing to make some projects in this series of work, this ongoing series of work. So really quickly, this River Stories looks at the cultural, political, and personal stories centered around the river. This came directly after working on Waterbound, Bravo Grande, and the Reclaim installation, and really just wanting to focus on people's stories, on our relationship with the river, and looking at that. And so a lot of the illustrations that come out in this work was utilizing a lot of the conversations and stories that had been shared with me while working on these other projects. So what you're seeing here is Rick Quesada, who you saw previously in the photograph with the quote about the river, now making this work in illustrated form after having made that transition to focusing more on illustration and moving away from painting. This is comic book storytelling. It's a very, I think, an effective way to tell story in this way, visually and with the narrative. So I'll just kind of go through here. Get a drink of water. You're seeing it a little bit out of order. These are just some excerpts from this narrative. Again, returning, this is one of the comics without text from River Stories, but again, looking at the generational change in the relationship with the river, right? A man who would go fishing at the river and now doesn't have access to it. So I'm not going to kind of go through River Stories. You can go to my website to read some of these stories and narratives. These are works in progress. I have not published this work widely because it is a work in progress. But please, take some time to look at that work if you have it. And what I'd like to talk about is how I'm going to continue working on this next phase of river stories. So in this next phase of river stories, I'm going to be focusing on two places and really thinking about place and the river and how that affects the stories and people's, experience. So the first place is in San Isidro in Mesilla Valley. This is where my mother's family has been living for a long time. After crossing the river and migrating from what was at the time Paso del Norte, which was a Spanish colony, and crossing the river because of a flood, my 4 times great-grandfather was a part of the Doniana Bend Colony Grant. And I want to say that this work is an effort on my part to I felt that it was very necessary, as I mentioned before, to understand my own relationship with the river before I could move forward, doing some of this work and really understand what my family's relationship has been with the river. And like many of our stories here in the region of Paso del Norte, it's very complex and complicated, right? And thinking about the relationship with the river, but also how my ancestors contributed to the displacement of indigenous people, right? And so I think understanding this history is an important thing, and understanding how we exist in this in-between space, right? At least for me. And so looking at things like the history. So this is what I'm hoping to do, is go through and expand more on this history. The farm that my 4 times great-grandfather was working on was at some point in Mexico, and then after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, the border was moved, and it was then became part of the United States. You can see just a quick image of the treaty here. And so, after turning inward, right, with family and friends in the community, right, and realizing that it was important to look at my own relationship, thinking about how this sense of being between two narratives, right, and being Chicano and being, from detribalized indigenous people and European colonizers, right, and settlers, and looking at that and how the relationship of the river has an impact on that, right? Like how our relationship with the river has changed over time. And so these, and this is on both sides of my family with the farming. On the left of your screen, this is my 2 times great-grandfather, my 1 time great-grandfather. And then on the right of your screen is my great-grandmother, my great-grandmother on my dad's side, who was a migrant farm worker. Also looking into archival research and following how things changed in the settlement of these Mexican farmers in San Isidro, and it's San Isidro with a Y. I should have clarified that earlier, excuse me. It's in the Mesilla Valley after the signing. And so this is what you're looking at here on the screen is some correspondence from 1866. And really what's at the heart of this work is obviously the river, but flooding. The river has shaped the history of our entire region, and we owe the river everything. And so flooding enters into a lot of the narratives and the correspondence around this place. Here are some sketches of some of my family, some of the people who are farming in this land and working on this land. And the narrative will be centered around the acequia madres that were dug there. Some of them are, still there today. See some of the pencil sketches here. And so the second part of the second place that I'll be focusing on is the American Dam. and looking at how the river is continuing to be destroyed, right? And this is attributed to border policy. And so the American Dam, as you see here, is located right next to boundary marker number 1. This is located at the foot of the Mount Cristo Rey mountain that is near, in between Anapra, Sunland Park, New Mexico, Ciudad Juarez, and El Paso, Texas. And so there's an aerial view. The dam there that you see where it says New Mexico is just yards away from the international boundary. And the American Dam was built, is attributed, I believe, from a treaty from 1906. And it is the way that currently today, the water from the river is allocated and really taken out of the river and placed into a canal, and is primarily in this specific section of the river is what contributes to the dire condition that the river is in. So it's an important place for many reasons. Here's some historical research looking at when this dam was built. It is it is also historically significant for other reasons, this area. You see boundary marker number 1 there, and you see the casita gris or casa adobe there in the background, which is a building from the Mexican Revolution where Madero's camp was set up. And this is some photos based on the research from David Romo from Ringside Seat to the Revolution. Here is a more recent image. And you can see how close the boundary is here to Casa Adobe. And just to the left, what would be on the left side of your screen would be the dam. And then also looking at how this place, continues to be occupied space, right? So this is a tourist posing in Mexican Revolution attire in front of Casa Adobe, and is probably standing on the international boundary or just on the other side of it. And looking at how the violence of the international boundary and border militarization is pervasive in our culture, right? This was an amazingly striking thing to me, given the recent mass shooting at Walmart, that Walmart would be selling prints of these boundary markers. I'm not sure who's buying those prints, but it's culture relevant. And looking at how today updating this narrative. So in River Stories, there's already some narrative about the American Dam, but my intention is to update those narratives because of this new wall that was built by this campaign, We Build the Wall, which was just, I have no words for it, honestly. Yeah, I have no words for it. But posing the question about how place is connected to identity and how American culture, cultural identity is often about erasure. So you see some pencil sketches here. This is the gate that is closed off. This is also just a personal, this is a place where I would go to be with the river, to spend time with the river during the time of doing this work. And that's where this wall is now. So those are the 2 places that I'll be focusing on to make more stories about the river stories. Just a couple more notes before I wrap up, and I'm looking forward to this panel discussion. I've been talking for a very long time. It's also strange not seeing other people's faces. I feel like I'm in a void. I don't know if anyone's there or not. But really quickly, as much as I'm looking into the past and looking at the history, I'm recently also very interested in what the future looks like. And so working on things that would fall into the category of speculative fiction or science fiction. And this image of the river to talk about it briefly, is basically a timeline of the river in one image, right? It's a very brief history of the river in one image, from the past on your left to the present on your right. And my intentions during this residency are to collaborate again with Augment El Paso to augment this work and hopefully expand a little bit more on some of the stories, the narratives and the history that is in here. And also speculative, cartoons. I'm always interested in doing political cartoons, and sometimes things like this come out, speculating on what ifs. What if this happens? So what if Oñate never made it across the river? What does that look like? How does that change history? And how would that change the river and the condition of the river? And then the last thing here is, you all will be the first people I'm sharing this with, at least the full image. I've shared some stuff on Instagram, but also thinking well into the future, 100+ years from now, and what does the border look like? What does the border wall look like, right? And how in the future does our relationship with the river change, and what does the river look like? So these are questions that I'm asking, and this is some work that I'm working on right now during this residency. So yeah, thank you so much for listening. I want to say that collaboration and community is really important to my work. And it's, this process has been really slow moving, and I've had to be really patient with this. But I want to invite all of you all. I'll be having some open studios to work on this if you'd like some updates, to have conversation, to take questions, if you'd like to offer me some feedback. I want to invite the students in the audience, the community members that are in the audience, UNM professors for ideas for engagement, ways that I can engage with you, the work you're doing, and your students. And thank you so much for this time and for this space and listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your work with everyone here tonight. And to members of our audience, please feel free to submit questions to us in the Q&A, and I see a couple coming in, so that's great. Thank you. Let's see. I guess one thing before we start real quick, I neglected to thank Devin Geraci, our marketing manager at the UNM Art Museum. When I did my remarks, Devin worked with Ellie on outreach and is behind the scenes making this talk go. So thank you, Devin. Sorry about that. Thought I'd maybe open up real quick to give maybe Zeke a little break since he was talking for a while. Maybe start with you, Subhankar. You mentioned briefly that Zeke is the first artist-in-residence for the Center for the Arts and Humanities. And I remember talking with you a little bit about this pre-pandemic. I guess maybe if you want to briefly talk about what role do you feel that bringing in artists to the program, kind of what role did you envision? What can they provide the students?
Thank you for starting with that, Arif, because first of all, I just want to say how grateful I am to you, Zeke, for accepting our invitation, because very clearly the work you are doing is a journey, and we are a small little sort of partner along the way to help it along. So I'm very grateful. We are very excited and grateful that you shared some of the work in progress, which a lot of the time artists or scholars don't like to really share publicly. You did that. So back to Arif's question, I want to make one quick observation, if I may, because the work you are doing is resonating with us at many different levels, not only in art and ecology, but at UNM. So I just want to share with you one thing. So for the longest time, artists, scholars, scientists from the dominant culture, whoever have done kind of place-based community engaged work, that the kind of work you're doing, that the kind of work that we talk about in art and ecology, it has largely for the most part, been about extraction. You go into the community, you extract whatever you can extract, knowledge, visuals, what have you, stories, you come back, and it serves your purpose as well as the purpose of larger colonial institutions. The kind of work you are doing is precisely offering a different way of what we mean by place, community engaged. So I'm very grateful for that. And there is a resonance. So in art and ecology, Arif's question, we define ourselves very simply, and I'm not speaking on behalf of all of my dear colleagues, some of whom are actually listening in, but generally it's like place-based, community engaged, research-based, creative practice, all of that comes in. But this idea of ethics and engagement, those things we wrestle with, we discuss. So one thing I want to share with you right before is a book by my dear colleague, dear friend, Nick Estes, who is indigenous from the Lower Brule Sioux tribe. Our history is the future. So you were ending your talk on a note that you're looking back at history, but you're interested in the future. And you talk about accessibility. You talked about the work that you're doing should be accessible to the communities in which you're collaborating with, and it should be accessible to, and it should be kind of geared for the young crowd. And that is exactly what Nick writes about. He said he wrote this book to a 17-year-old kid. That was Nick Estes was. So you basically said almost exactly the same thing. So I love these resonances, and I'm grateful that this work is taking place in our communities, in our region. So thank you. This was just a remark, just to say that the work that you are bringing to us is incredibly, incredibly beneficial to our students. And I'm grateful to Arif, particularly because there is a scholarly component to it, as your work highlights, but there is also a public outreach component to it. And that's what the museum does. So bringing the two together was really essential for us. And I think I could not have thought of any better and more generous, more kind, more expansive presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Subhankar. And that's a good kind of summary and maybe lead into kind of the lived experience of this residency, which happened today. Ellie, could you maybe start off with how Zeke interfaced with your class, and Zeke, please chime in as well, kind of how that process went. Ellie, I know you mentioned you were first-year students. This also must be a challenge, being a first-year grad student, doing all this virtually as well. So I don't know, there's a lot there, but I kind of want to just open up that space and let you all kind of talk about how it all went today.
Cool, thank you for that fun open-ended question. The talk today went really well, I thought. Yeah, I think it's been mentioned a few times that Zeke's work is really like intergenerationally appealing and exciting. And I think the students really enjoyed the work. And we've had a couple of guest speakers in the class, but most of them have been like, art and ecology faculty and stuff. And so I think seeing someone who's really like an artist and an illustrator who's making really relevant work to their community and to like, I don't know, speaking to issues that are important right now and issues that are really important to students, like the undergrads in the class are all really invested in like the health of the river and the health of the ecological systems. And on the first day of class, when everyone talked about why they're in this class, everyone's like, the environment, I care so much about it. And the students from all these different departments too, coming from all over the university. And I think your work really provides these entry points for how to engage like artistically in these issues in ways that feel like accessible to join into. I think it went really well, and I really appreciated your presence there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was really exciting to meet with them, and I'm always, the conversation was somewhat short, but I'm always interested to see how other people are doing their practice, right, and what they're interested in. But I think to touch on some of the things that Subhankar was also talking about, which is the accessibility thing, is that, I mean, that's first and foremost for me, is that if the work is not accessible, and this is a great space to have this in, right? Because if you're in academic spaces, at least from my experience, sometimes that knowledge is not always the knowledge and the resources that are in these spaces aren't always accessible to the communities that they could most serve. So I kind of see myself being somewhat of a mediary of how to take some of these things and make it a little bit more accessible. Also make it engaging, right? Like it doesn't have to always be like really intellectualized work. And I think for me, to the person who made that book, Subhankar, was the 17-year-old person, is always asking this question throughout this process of trying to understand this like dissonance, this cognitive dissonance, right? Like of my lack of understanding of how the river is as just in my person, right? Like how do I engage with that? Like how has that changed over time? And with the intent of trying to protect the river, right? With the intent of trying to protect the river so that our future generations have a river to live with. And so for me, if young people in Bowie High School are not making a connection with even identifying this place as being a river, how can we even get to the point of engagement and an action, right? So it's a long game, it's like a long-term thing, but and that's story, right? So how can story bring us closer to the river?
Thank you. On that note, if I could just add one small thing to Arif's question, that Zeke, in the morning, you visited also Dylan McLaughlin's class. Ellie is a first-year MFA student in art and ecology. Dylan is graduating from art and ecology with MFA. And the exhibit that Arif talked about, which is at the museum in its virtual form, there must be other names for the river, was created by Dylan and his two dear fellow students, Marisa DeMarco and Jessica Zeglin, along with 7 musicians. So I just wanted to connect that dot, that you also visited, and you sent me a very lovely text in the morning after the visit to that class. So I was very happy that the day had started really well.
Yeah, it was great. It was an engaging conversation, and all the students had, as early as it was, everyone was attentive and had great stuff to say. And these are, and I left, I left inspired. I left asking questions for myself, like, so, and that's kind of what helps me through my process, right? The work is collaborative, and having conversation with people is usually a great way of thinking about different ideas. So meeting with students and meeting with the class is something that I love, and I hope there'll be more of it. I'm looking forward to more of it.
And thank you, everyone. And thank you for the plug, Subhankar, for There Must Be Other Names for the River. Let's jump to some questions from our audience. Let's move on next. So I have a two-parter here. Zeke, what do you believe is the biggest misconception about La Frontera? And why do you feel it is important for an artist to write from this liminal and heavily surveilled and colonized space?
Oh, that's heavy. Thank you so much, Andrea. It's a friend from El Paso. The biggest misconception, I don't even know. There's so many to pick from. There's so much misconception, I think, in the media. I think what comes to mind, and this is something that I'm looking at in the work right now and in the research, is how this concept of being wild, right? The myth of the Wild West, right? And how these myths and these narratives have echoed you know, through time, and they continue today, right? And that is the space that we live in is a space that needs to be tamed, and that's something that's paralleled with the river. Any change that has been made to the river has been made to tame it, has been made to control it, right? And if the river is a being, right, and that being is being oppressed, right? So how to think differently about the space that we live in, and understand the history. I also am always being attentive to the words that we use, and how the Southwest, we refer to our area as the Southwest. But I always ask the question, south and west of what, right? Why are we using these relative terms to identify where we're from? When you look historically about our area, it's one of the oldest places on this continent, right? At Hueco Tanks, you know, for 10,000 years, there have been people there, and there's documentation of people being there. So how are we not also acknowledged in this narrative, in this national narrative about being a place with a deep and important history, right? And I feel like that deep and important history has repercussions with how our people are perceived and treated, and the people who come here are perceived and treated, right? That's just one that comes to mind. Yeah. And then I think it's important to make work for all of those reasons, to engage with those ideas, engage with those topics, and see how to confront them, right? Often, hopefully, with humor and satire. Like, let's make fun of it. I like making fun of things that are terrible. It's because it's how we deal, you know?
Zeke. We have a question here about, you talked a lot about all the work you do with various members of the community, different organizations, individuals. And this was actually a question I had. If we didn't have a lot, I was going to put up my museum director hat on and ask the audience member is interested in knowing why the shift away from painting. Since you talked about cyclical work, will you come back to this type of work? And I might add on a little bit is maybe if you want to share any remarks about how that shift has maybe been received by the quote unquote traditional art world, right? Art museums, galleries, that. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that. And thank you, Andy, who is the person that I'm collaborating with, who's doing the amazing work around the river. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the question. Yeah, so the shift away from painting was looking at the work that I had been making for a long time. I mean, really since high school, I was on this trajectory to be like a painter, right? And I feel that in short, it was out of an obligation. I at some point realized that I was making work to look in this particular way because I felt obligated to, because I felt that this is what work looked like, right? And in my community and in my family, that's what good, art looks like, is it looks this particular way, right? But the reasons were also very just practical, that it was more efficient to tell stories in a comic book storytelling or illustrated way. And then thinking about the topic, right? Like if I'm making work that is centered around water and centered around river, but I'm making that work using toxic materials that are oil paints, those two things are, they don't harmonize, they don't line up. So it was kind of looking holistically at my practice, and just knowing that I connected with the drawing line in a comic a little bit more, and I was more comfortable in that space. And then to address the question of how it was received, fortunately pretty well, honestly. I don't know why. I always assumed that it was going to be really hard, but throughout my career, I was always doing two things. I was always making comic books and zines and DIY things, but then also making like the serious like art thing that was going to go here. And at some point, I just stopped like caring about that distinction, and I no longer make that distinction anymore. And to quickly answer the question about, do I plan on returning back? I definitely plan to paint again. As I get more time to work on these stories, I'm hoping to paint, using water-based mediums that aren't, toxic, and not, using a whole lot of resources to make them. I work on a smaller scale now so that it's not so consumptive for resources, and shipping and in storage and all the things. So yeah, thanks for the question.
I might, Ellie, if you want to chime in a little bit on that. I didn't know, from my time at the museum, I've had some students talk to me about kind of that tension between making work that is more responsive, what people traditionally think of in the museum, versus more kind of community outreach, social practice works. As yourself as a student, or for some of in the classes, is that something that you all discuss? Did that come up when you talked with Zeke?
Totally, yeah, thank you for that question. I just want to address one thing really quick before I forget, which is that in my class, a couple of students are trying to make like soil-based paints and like experimenting with a bunch of different materials and leaves. They're like soaking leaves in water for like 5 weeks to make paint out of them. So that could be something you try. But yeah, I definitely have a couple like painters in the class who now, after taking this class, are like troubled about the realities of oil painting, and trying to find alternatives. So that's just a quick aside. I think for me personally, I'm not someone who's ever been like an extremely technically skilled drawer or painter. That's just never been part of my work. And I think that was like, in my life, I've always thought I was like bad at art because I couldn't like draw a realistic person portrait or something. And I think it only came to me like later on in my life. I was like, oh, I really like doing like work with people. I like workshops. I like bringing people into a space together and like creating some sort of like experience for people to have. And I think only later on I realized that that was also art, right? And also I could be an artist and do that and not like paint with oil paints. I think that is a tension, and I think I see that with my students as well. I think there's a very clear divide, right, of people who are like painters and drawers and are sort of just like loosening themselves up to seeing that you can do other things and still be an art major and like still be an artist. And other students, right, who are coming from all these other academic disciplines and different majors, but have like these creative inclinations, right, that maybe still aren't like, I'm going to paint or draw this perfect thing, but I want to create some weird project, and can I still be an artist and do that? And I'm like, yes, totally. So yeah.
This is a very productive conversation. So I'll just mention one quick thing on that. So we just published a book called Routledge Companion to Contemporary Art, Visual Culture and Climate Change that I co-edited with two dear colleagues. Both are art historians, T.J. Demos and Emily Eliza Scott. So we had the book launch last Friday. One of the authors, there are 40 chapters contributed by nearly 50 artists and scholars all over the world. One of the authors is Julie Z, a leading scholar of environmental justice. And so when I reached out to Julie, and she said, Subhankar, I don't write on art and visual culture. How am I going to write? I said, you have to. So then she made a proposal that she's going to write about humor, the role of humor, creative humor in addressing the climate crisis, because you talk about intergeneration and humor. So I'm just connecting a couple of dots there. And then she made a proposal that she's going to write about Dallas Goldtooth. I said, do not waste your time, just start writing. And so many of you may know who Dallas Goldtooth is, but if not, in my opening remarks, I mentioned the 1991 First Person of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. So at that summit, Tom Goldtooth, who is the founder and executive director of the Indigenous Environmental Network, a friend of mine. So Tom was also the facilitator for the entire indigenous nations for that environmental space, environmental justice space. And for 30 years, he did that work. His son today, Dallas Goldtooth, is carrying forward that work. So Dallas is one of our most inspiring grassroots activists who also actually came from a filmmaking, right? Humorous Films, 1491. Those of you who have seen it online, is being written now inside a very academic book. So all of these barriers and boundaries that we are talking about is kind of meaningless for our time, because the crisis that we are facing, immediate crisis, everything from the pandemic to climate to biodiversity to social injustice and racism, everything else, these barriers and boundaries don't make any sense. So that's why your work, Zeke, and the work that Eli was talking about, Arif, supports and advocates for, are where we are creating a new community. This is why I'll end with this. I like to make a simple joke that I always believe that New Yorkers should read The New Yorker. Let other people do what is more meaningful to them. And I think that's what we are doing here in New Mexico and in our region. So thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Subhankar. That's a good actual transition into the next question we have, which is based New Mexico. So I'll just kind of read off here. Zeke, growing up in Cruces and El Paso, what was your experience in view of the river? This individual did an oral history project to ask people in Juarez, El Paso, Mesilla Valley region what they remembered about the river. Talks about some generational differences. Somewhere along the line, people started thinking that the river was off limits, occupied territory. Was that your perception growing up? As a river restoration advocate, that has always been one of our biggest challenges, to help people see that the river could actually be a river again. I'll throw in, I grew up in Albuquerque. The Rio Grande comes through our city. I know a lot of our UNM students are from New Mexico and probably have lots of growing up experiences with the river. So Zeke, if you want to maybe chime in on your personal thoughts there.
Yeah. And well, I'll go off of what you just said, which is visiting the river in Albuquerque is beautiful, right? The cottonwoods and, during the fall and the sound, and it's a place where I like to visit to, be with the river and go for a walk, maybe a run. And my experience growing up was, what this person, thank you for the question in the comments, first of all, Mr. Bigsby, Kevin. And so, was that it was not a place to go, that we don't have access to it, that, we don't have access to the space around the river. And we're being kept, from the river, right? At least on the north side. And I also, want to acknowledge Patricia Riggs in the audience. Thank you for the question. The question was, are there differences between the south part of the river and the south side of the river and the north side of the river? And there are, because there's no wall on the other side, right? There's no wall. So you see a little bit of fencing, going up now in the kind of main part of the city, but on the outskirts, there are parks next to the river, and it's being managed in a very different way. But my personal experience was that, it was crossing the river was my relationship with the river, which I think is a lot of people's relationship with the river currently, most people. And so I think it is a matter of, there is a pretty big gap there, right? Of how do we, how can we encourage people to engage with the river in a different way, which is tough because, as militarization continues to just, steamroll and move forward, it becomes increasingly harder. Even just in the 7 or 8 years that I've been doing this work, it's a new wall has gone up. There are, more fencing that's going in between, surveillance. So, but my personal experience with the river, with the river as it should be, was, in Las Cruces, right? Like having interactions there, being in that space, and then also being in Sunland Park, in areas like that. My mom was an elementary school teacher in Sunland Park Elementary in New Mexico, and so we also have family there. So it's like being in that space, and so it's always stands out to me. It's just this stark difference. It's in the span of a quarter mile, you just see this dramatic change in the condition and just the way that it looks. So yeah.
As being away in Arkansas, not being in that space, has that changed maybe having some distance? Has that altered your thoughts a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, as I put my mind on it more, I think that what's changed is that you can go for a hike here and there's like a creek just hanging out someplace right down the way there. There's creeks all over the place. And so, and it's very interesting to see the way that a city that is not a border city or a border region is able to manage the river and treat the river in a better way, right? Like they're taking care of it, and there's watershed conservancies, and there's all these things which are not as present or don't exist at all in El Paso because it is, they use this term, the no man's land. It's no man's land, no person's land. So, yeah.
I'll just add one quick student experience to that. Is a lot of your work, you talked about this imagining the future, and that future is really the kind of work you are doing, just like Nick Estes calls our history is the future. Your history is the future. The work that you are creating will define the future, not what the social scientists are predicting, this, that, and other things that might or might not happen in 2050. One quick student experience that I'll share very quickly is Paula Barto, who I saw earlier. Paula was on this call, and I was so glad to see. So Paula was an undergraduate student, and she graduated from UNM. She's a poet, she's an artist, and she is a biologist. And I think she got dual degree in biology and art. So she was in one of the classes that I taught, and at the beginning of the class, I had just said very simply and casually that you have just maintain a daily journal. That's it. And if I remember correctly, is that Paula was probably the only person in that whole class who actually faithfully did that. So in December, when we came together to look at everyone's work, she had a sketchbook of more than 200 drawings of bats along the Rio Grande, middle Rio Grande, here in the Bosque, because presumably she went out every evening and watched these bats, many different species, and drew them. And she said, this class is just a start. My life now begins with thinking about bats. So the way we tell these stories and the relations, we don't like, that would define the future, not the technocrats, the bureaucrats, the policymakers, and so on and so forth. So artists, writers, students have probably more to contribute to imagining and pushing back against these truly destructive forces. So thank you. Yeah. Ellie, do you want to add anything, especially that Arif's question, which went in the reverse direction from the borderlands to Arkansas, but you moved from Chicago to here?
I did, yeah. I moved from Chicago in August, which is just a totally different place in terms of water quantity, and also I think, water relationship as like a public space that people go to. Yeah, I think moving here, it's definitely, I've always lived next to water my whole life, a lot of it. And so it's very shocking to be in a really dry place. And when I moved here, actually, or when I was looking for a place over the summer, a friend, or actually Dylan, who's come up a few times, was giving me advice on where to live. And he's like, you definitely want to live near the river. Like, it's a real sanctuary. Like, you're going to want to go there all the time. And I'm so grateful that he said that to me, because I think just immediately, as soon as I got here, you can feel like the pulse of the city is the river, and that's like where you want to be, and that's where everyone wants to be, that's where everyone is. Especially, moving here in the summer, in the evenings, how many people were there, and people were swimming in the river and like there with their families and their kids and their dogs. And yeah, it's a really beautiful relationship here to it. I've never been down to the El Paso region, so I can't speak to that.
I think, Ellie, what you're saying, and I noticed this, and I was one of these people who maybe from growing up here have taken it for granted a little bit, but I think the pandemic, I think opened a lot of people's eyes who maybe have, as Zeke was saying, maybe only just drove past or drove over, but having the open space and the ability to get out, I think drew a lot of people back to the river if they hadn't been in there. And I think we're getting close to time here, but I want to have this last question. We talked about I'm making a little bit of a connection here, but Zeke was talking about accessibility to the river down in Cruces, and this question is about accessibility as well in your work, regarding in your comics with text, and doing bilingual, working in Spanish and English. How have you navigated that issue of accessibility through your work?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I believe it came from Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. And so it's a tough thing. You know, I try to do my best to have it in all languages or both languages. In terms of the interviews, though, I can speak to the interviews, is that I've thought that it was important to have the interviews in the interviewee's original language. So those usually stay as they are. But, you know, my intentions are to have it in both English and Spanish translated in its entirety. But at this point, I'm continuing to work on it. It's a project that's an ongoing work in progress. I know some of those comics from the kind of the first phase will be edited, but definitely once it resolves somewhat to where it can be published on a wider scale, I have intentions of translating it in both, and then also exploring the idea of having it be an audio comic to make it more accessible that way.